I'm Seraphina Sterling, and I was 34 on the muggy Tuesday morning my parents drove 3 hours to sell a piece of land they had absolutely no idea I legally owned. But to make any sense of that circus, we have to rewind exactly 9 years. It was my 25th birthday, and a single call from my mother blew my reality apart. She called to casually let me know they couldn't make it again. My entire existence up to that point was defined by being the strong one. My sister Sloane was the fragile glass doll they constantly hovered over. That morning, I finally accepted my assigned role in the family. So I packed a single duffel bag, walked out the door, and vanished. What I did the morning of that birthday and the 8 years I spent resurrecting a half-dead ranch miles away from anyone who shared my last name is the punchline none of them ever saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people finally set hard boundaries and quietly build their own empires. If a story like this finds you tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. Drop a comment below and subscribe so the next one reaches you too. My reality today starts at 4:30 in the pitch black. I step out into the biting frost with 40 horses waiting for their feed. I run a massive boarding and training operation tucked away in the eastern hills. 200 acres of prime grazing land, a specialized rescue program out back, and a waiting list 11 names deep. People drive past my heavy iron gates and assume some rich relative left it all to me. They couldn't be more wrong. I carved this place out of pure dirt using my own 2 hands, a busted pickup truck, and a level of sheer stubbornness that scared most men away. My apprentice Casey is 19 and already handles a nervous yearling better than I did at 30. She walked up to me this morning carrying 2 black coffees and a question about a colicky gelding. I checked the horse, walked him out, and gave her the fix. Then I reached for my grandfather's battered leather gloves hanging by the tack room. The knuckles are worn completely soft and they don't even fit me right. I don't care. There is an entire history of survival stitched into that leather, and I put them on every single day because 8 years ago, I had absolutely none of this. I had a quarter tank of gas and my mother's dismissive voice rattling around in my skull. "You're the strong one," she used to tell me, tossing it out like a medal of honor. I spent my youth blindly believing that being the reliable daughter meant I was loved differently. It took me a painfully long time to realize it just meant I was loved less and expected to say thank you for it. Let me take you back to the cramped kitchen where the illusion finally broke, right before I learned anything about property deeds, horse rehabilitation, and the massive gap between blood relatives and the family you actually choose. Back then, I was renting a damp room across town and hauling heavy bags at a local feed store, scraping pennies together for a vet tech program. My parents lived just 3 highway exits away in the house I grew up in. My mother, Sharon, operated that house like an emergency triage ward, and Sloane was her perpetual, tragic patient. My dad, Wade, just nodded along to keep the peace, agreeing with whatever Sharon screamed last. And Sloane, she had a terrifying talent. She could take a perfectly boring Tuesday and twist it into a 5-alarm fire that required everyone's immediate attention. A bad date morphed into a psychological breakdown. A parking ticket became a full-blown crisis of confidence that paralyzed the whole house. I figured out the warning signs early on, the way you learn to smell a thunderstorm rolling in. Whenever the air in that kitchen got heavy, somebody's plans were about to be canceled, and it was never going to be Sloane's. I'd tried to bring it up once, very carefully, the previous spring. "It feels like there's only ever room for one of us in this family," I mumbled across the table. Sharon didn't even stop wiping the counter. "Sloane's more delicate, honey, you know that." I did know. I had it beaten into my head since childhood. It wasn't just an observation, it was a life sentence handed down at birth. The tough one, the capable one, the one who would always bounce back. Nobody bothered to ask if I actually wanted to be fine. They simply built their chaotic lives on top of my silence. To truly grasp what I was up against, look at my college graduation 2 years prior. Associate's degree in animal science. First person in my family to finish anything past high school, and I worked brutal night shifts to pay for it. The ceremony kicked off at 10 in the morning. At 9:15, Sloan miraculously fainted in the parking lot, or at least she claimed she did. By the time the paramedics checked her vitals, rolled their eyes, and left, my parents were coddling her in the back seat of their sedan. I walked across that auditorium stage completely alone, staring out at a sea of cheering strangers, trying to spot a single familiar face. They finally strolled in for the last 10 minutes. Sharon immediately snapped a picture of Sloan recovering with an ice pack and posted it online long before she bothered to take a photo of me holding my diploma. I know because I saw it in the family group chat that night. The chat labeled Sinclair Fam, a group I technically belonged to but functionally didn't exist in. 41 panicked messages obsessing over Sloan's little scare, exactly 2 messages acknowledging my degree, both consisting of lazy thumbs-up emojis. I silenced the chat, but I didn't delete it. People love to ask why the scapegoat doesn't just cut ties sooner. Here is the ugly truth. You stay because you're waiting for the day they finally see your worth. Every almost keeps you chained to the hope. By 25, I was suffocating under a mountain of almosts. I had absolutely no idea I was just 2 weeks away from the final insult that would cut the line for good. I planned my 25th birthday carefully, like I was disarming a bomb. I booked a private back room at a local steakhouse, 8 chairs. I dropped a $100 deposit straight out of my own savings. I wasn't asking them to pay or plan a single thing. Just show up on a Saturday night at 7. I drove to their house on a Tuesday to deliver the invitation to their faces, knowing a text would be conveniently ignored. Sharon sat at the kitchen table, aggressively writing checks for Sloan's bills. My birthday dinner's Saturday, I stated clearly. I've got it all handled. She gave me the kind of tight nod you give a passing coworker. My dad mumbled that it sounded nice. Knowing the vicious cycle of that house, I asked the fatal question out loud. Is there anything going on Saturday I should know about? Sharon slammed her pen down. We can only show up for one of you at a time, Seraphina. You understand? I didn't understand at all, but I swallowed the lump in my throat and said yes, because arguing never changed the outcome. It only cost me more energy. I drove back to my rented room, foolishly trusting that my non-refundable deposit meant they were locked in. I actually slept peacefully that week. I let myself visualize a normal evening, 8 full chairs, a small cake, and maybe my mother raising a glass in my direction just once. The blind certainty is the part that embarrasses me the most now. I truly believed a restaurant deposit bought me a fair fight. I should have realized that a rigged house always changes the rules right when you're about to win. The sabotage started Thursday with a vague text from Sloan in the family chat. Feeling really off lately, scared. Sharon replied in 90 seconds flat. I had never received a 90-second reply in my entire life. By Friday afternoon, feeling off had escalated into a full-blown medical crisis with a brand new twist. Sloan's boyfriend had magically proposed, and they demanded an impromptu engagement dinner on Saturday at 7, the exact samplot I had booked a month prior. I want to be brutally honest about my reaction, because I've analyzed this moment to death. I didn't throw a tantrum. I didn't cry. I picked up my phone and called my sister directly. Sloan, I said, keeping my voice dead level, that is my birthday dinner. You've known this for weeks. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the line. Then I heard this tiny, infuriatingly fragile voice respond. I didn't realize. I'm just so anxious, Seraphina. Can't we combine them? Combine them. My 25th birthday folded into her engagement party like a cheap paper napkin shoved under a plate. I kept my voice perfectly steady and told her no. Then I immediately dialed my mother and laid out the facts. Same restaurant chain, different night, an incredibly simple fix. Sharon listened to my logic, and then she said the words that finally proved to me that Saturday was already a lost cause. "Sloane's in a very fragile place right now," she sighed. "Can't you just be flexible? You're so good at that." Flexible, the strong one's alternative title. I hung up the phone, sat on the edge of my mattress, and finally did the brutal math I had actively avoided for 25 years. I tallied up every single canceled event, every hollow almost, every 90-second text response that was never meant for me, and for the very first time, the final sum didn't break my heart. It made me incredibly, intensely calm, because that Saturday wasn't a scheduling conflict or a misunderstanding. It was a documented pattern with a specific date attached to it. Sitting in that quiet room, I finally understood that the only way to stop losing their rigged game was to permanently walk away from the table.
The official cancellation call came on Saturday at exactly noon, a mere 7 hours before my dinner reservation. Sharon's voice was warm, polished, and clearly rehearsed. "Honey, we're going to focus on Sloane's engagement tonight. We knew you'd understand. We'll celebrate your birthday another time, I promise." Another time. The classic promise that never actually comes with a calendar date. I stood in my cramped kitchen, the phone pressed hard against my ear, watching a square of late afternoon light crawl across the linoleum floor. I asked the only question I had left. "Why is it always me, Mom?" And she didn't say it with malice. That's the detail people always struggle to believe. She said it gently, with the patience you'd use to explain something very obvious to a slow child. "You're our strong one, Seraphina. Sloane is the one who actually needs us." And there it was, the entire architecture of my childhood summed up in 11 simple words. I didn't scream or argue or negotiate. I just said, "Okay." And I meant a profoundly different okay than the one she heard. I hung up, called the steakhouse, canceled my table, and told them to keep the deposit. Then I dragged my duffel bag out of the closet and started packing. I packed with the slow, methodical rhythm of someone who knows they are never coming back.
2 pairs of heavy denim, my worn-out work boots, and the small metal cash box from under my bed. I didn't have a grand master plan. I just had a geographic direction. 3 hours east, way past the final highway gas station, lived the one man who had never once canceled on me in 25 years, even when it would have been infinitely easier to do so. My grandfather, Earl, Sharon's own father, the man she had quietly written off as a stubborn old failure clinging to a dying piece of land. I got into my car at 4 in the afternoon with a quarter tank of gas and my entire life shoved into the back seat. I drove straight toward the only person who had ever consistently shown up. It was a long, isolating drive, and somewhere around the second hour, the physical shaking started. It wasn't from sadness, it was the sheer adrenaline of something massive finally snapping. I called Earl from a flickering payphone outside the county line. He picked up on the second ring, which is a profound kind of love when you've spent your life waiting for 90-second responses that never arrive. "Grandpa, it's Seraphina. Can I come stay for a while?" There were no interrogations, no demands for an explanation, just an unlocked door. "There's stew on the stove," he said. I hung up the receiver and stood shivering under the biting cold under the harsh gas station canopy. For the very first time, I let myself feel exactly how exhausted I was from a lifetime of auditioning. I had spent 25 years desperately trying to prove I was valuable enough to keep, and the one person who never made me audition for his love lived on a run-down ranch my own mother was deeply ashamed of. I pulled onto Earl's property a little after midnight. My headlights swept across a badly sagging barn, miles of fencing missing half its rails, and a single porch light he had deliberately left on for me. He was sitting on the wooden steps in a heavy flannel coat, 71 years old, holding a thermos and an extra mug. He didn't rush to hug me or offer platitudes. He simply patted the rough step beside him and muttered, "Rough birthday." Something about the absolute plainness of his words broke me wide open. I sat down on that cold wood and told him everything. I told him about the restaurant deposit, the sudden engagement dinner, and those 11 crushing words my mother had said. He listened the entire way through without interrupting a single time, which felt like a miracle all on its own. When I finally finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, staring out at the dark silhouettes of his horses. Then he said something that took me years to fully comprehend. "Sharon learned the wrong lesson a long time ago," he murmured into the dark. "But the land doesn't care who your mother loves. Land only cares who works it." I had absolutely no idea sitting there that he was already giving me the blueprint for my entire future. I woke up the next morning to the smell of strong coffee and the sounds of a man who had been awake for 3 hours trying to pretend he hadn't. In the harsh daylight, Earl's ranch was in worse shape than it looked at midnight. 80 acres he simply couldn't manage alone anymore. 6 aging horses, a barn roof threatening to cave in, and miles of fencing that a strong gust of wind could have finished off. He had been running it straight into the ground out of pure, stubborn pride, flatly refusing to sell and refusing to beg Sharon for help. She would have charged him emotional interest on it anyway. Over eggs, he laid it out plain, not as charity, but as a business proposition, which was the only way my pride would have ever accepted it. "I've got the land and no body," he stated, pouring more coffee. "You've got a capable body and no land. Seems fairly simple to me."
He stood up, walked over to an old iron hook by the door, and tossed me a pair of heavy work gloves. They were cracked brown leather, worn incredibly soft at the knuckles, and at least 2 sizes too big. "These were my father's," he told me. "They'll fit when you've finally earned them." I honestly thought it was just a poetic figure of speech. I pulled them on, walked outside, and attempted to fix a broken fence line I had absolutely no idea how to repair. By noon, I had cut my hands completely raw inside that ancient leather. That first week nearly broke me in half. I had never actually built a physical thing in my life that wasn't a digital savings account. But there is a profound shift that happens when you start working the land. It never lies to you. A wooden post you set correctly stays standing. A horse you feed consistently comes back to the gate. For the very first time in my life, my sheer effort and the resulting reward lined up in a direct, straight line, with no mother standing in the middle to steal or redirect the credit. I didn't call a single person. I didn't tell my family where I had disappeared to. And in the heavy silence of all those unsent text messages, I began, very slowly, to finally hear the sound of my own thoughts.
June arrived in March, hauled in a rusted stock trailer that reeked of severe neglect. A neighbor had found her abandoned in a foreclosed dirt lot. She was a bay mare so severely starved you could have easily hung a hat on her jetting hip bones. Her ribs looked like a xylophone, and her eyes were completely flat and empty. Absolutely nobody wanted her. The local vet quoted an astronomical number to attempt to bring her back, adding bluntly, "Honestly, it might not even." Earl looked at me. I looked at the broken mare. "We can't afford her," I whispered. "We can't afford to leave her here either," he replied gruffly, turning to grab a halter. I named her June because I figured that was the month she would either finally turn the corner or simply give up. I learned more about true patience from that ruined horse than from any human being I have ever known. You cannot rush a starved animal. If you feed her too much, too fast, you will literally kill her with kindness. Her system was too wrecked to handle the exact thing she desperately needed to survive. So you go agonizingly slow, tiny, measured meals 6 times a day for months on end. You earn a single ounce of trust at a time. I would sit in her stall long after dark, intentionally not touching her, just existing in her space, exactly the way Earl had patted the porch step beside him that first night. And somewhere in the quiet of those cold nights, it hit me. I had been that mare for 25 years, severely starved while sitting at a fully set table, constantly told I wasn't actually hungry because I had learned the hard way never to ask for a plate. June violently flinched every single time I raised my hand, even if it was just to scratch her neck, and I knew that exact flinch from the inside out. The very first morning she actually walked to the gate to meet me, instead of cowering in the far corner, I dropped into the mud and cried like the world was ending. It wasn't ending. It was the first genuine morning of the rest of my life. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. But I had brought a massive flaw with me to the ranch, the kind of flaw no childhood simply lets you walk away from for free. I could not, for the absolute life of me, accept help from anyone. I had played the role of the strong one for so long that needing assistance felt exactly like handing an enemy a loaded weapon. So I just worked. I worked until the skin on my hands split, my back completely seized up, and I passed out in my heavy boots. When a neighboring farmer offered to bring his tractor over to clear the south field, I aggressively told him I had it covered. I didn't have it covered at all. I had bleeding blisters, a rusted shovel, and a massive point to prove to a family that wasn't even watching. Earl figured me out incredibly fast. One evening, he found me trying to right a heavy fence post completely alone in the dark, soaked to the bone from the rain, and physically shaking. He didn't step in to help me, he just leaned quietly against the rail and watched, until I finally collapsed and gave up. "You really think being strong means doing everything by yourself?" he asked over the rain. "That's not strength, Seraphina. That's just building the exact same cage with slightly nicer scenery." I immediately told him I was fine, the strong one's 2 favorite empty words. He just shook his head slowly. "Your mother convinced you you don't need anybody," he said softly, "and now you're out here proving her right out of pure stubborn spite." I went to sleep furious that night, which is usually the bitter sound of someone being entirely right about your flaws. The next morning, I swallowed my pride, picked up the phone, and called the neighboring farmer about that tractor. Dialing those numbers cost my ego more than the back-breaking labor would have cost my spine. But he brought his equipment, the south field was completely cleared by sunset, and he even stuck around for a cup of black coffee on the porch. That afternoon, I learned a quiet truth. Letting someone help you doesn't drain your well, it actually fills it. My mother, Helen, had meticulously wired me to run on absolute empty and brainwashed me into calling it independence. Out here in the dirt, very slowly, I was finally learning the massive difference between standing on your own 2 feet and standing completely alone. They are not the same thing. Nobody in my family had ever bothered to teach me that. If you've ever been branded the strong one until it simply became a convenient excuse to abandon you, you already know exactly how heavy that duffel bag felt when I threw it into my back seat. Stay with me here. The part that shifts the ground beneath your feet is coming. And if this is hitting a nerve, stick around for the ending, because by the close of that brutal first year, the tide finally started to turn. Our very first official boarding client was a tough, no-nonsense woman named Beatrice who kept a retired barrel racer.
She paid her board exactly on time every single month and told 2 of her friends about us. Then those friends told their friends. I had grown up watching Helen ruthlessly ration out her affection as if it were a scarce, depleting resource. Out here, I discovered the exact opposite was true when it came to honest labor. Do the job once, do it right, and the respect multiplies on its own. Bramble, my throwaway rescue mare, was fully rideable by late fall. Her coat was glossy, her ribs were covered, and that terrifying, flat emptiness had completely vanished from her eyes. People who had witnessed her stumbling off that rusted stock trailer started trailering in their own hard cases. They brought me the biters, the chronic bolters, the dangerous horses the fancy trainers down the highway had completely given up on. I was incredibly good with them. Of course I was. I had spent my entire existence intensely studying how a living creature learns to anticipate the absolute worst, and how, with enough slow, agonizingly patient proof, it can finally learn to expect something better. Silas started introducing me around the feed store as my granddaughter, the one who runs the place.
The very first time Silas introduced me that way, I had to physically turn around and pretend to inspect a broken gate latch so he wouldn't see my eyes tear up. Runs the place. Not just visiting, not just helping out. Runs it. I was 26 years old. The skin on my hands was permanently ruined. I fell into bed bone-tired almost every single night, and I was profoundly, violently happier than I had ever been sitting in my mother's suffocating living room. The horses didn't care if I lacked a delicate constitution. The barbed wire fences didn't care if I wasn't the favorite daughter. Out here in the mud, for the first time in my life, I got exactly what I earned with my own sweat. No more and absolutely no less. It turned out that was the only thing I had ever really wanted. The first phone call from my old life came 18 months after I drove away. They didn't call to find out if I was alive, they called to use me. Helen's contact name lit up my cracked phone screen one Sunday morning while I was up to my elbows deworming a pair of rowdy yearlings. I honestly almost let it ring out into the dirt. I only answered because 18 months of radio silence is just long enough for stupid hope to grow back like a stubborn weed.
Seraphina? Helen cooed, her voice as sickeningly warm as a door-to-door salesman. Then, in the very next breath, before I could even process the fake affection, came the inevitable ask. Maya was severely behind on her car payments. Her ridiculous rush wedding had spectacularly fallen apart, the unemployed fiancé had vanished, and she was really struggling. Could I maybe transfer some money to help my poor sister get back on her feet? I stood dead still in the barn aisle, gripping a plastic tube of horse paste, bracing myself for the familiar, crushing guilt, the old reflex that used to force me to empty my bank account for people who wouldn't even pull out a chair for me. The guilt never came. Something vital had permanently scarred over while I wasn't looking. "How did you even get this number?" I asked, flatly, because I had changed it my second week at the ranch. A sharp pause on the line. "Maya found you online. The ranch has a website now." So that's exactly what I was to them. Not a missing daughter they had desperately searched for, a financial asset they had finally located on Google. I told Helen I wasn't in a position to send cash, a blatant lie I felt absolutely zero remorse about, and asked her not to contact me regarding their finances again. Her tone snapped from honey to ice in a fraction of a second. The salesman warmth instantly vanished. "After everything this family sacrificed for you," she started to hiss. I hit the red button and ended the call before she could finish a toxic sentence I had already memorized thousands of times over. I went right back to my yearlings, but a freezing sensation settled into my chest for the rest of the afternoon. A deeply unsettling realization I couldn't shake off. They knew exactly where I was now. They knew the boarding operation was real and generating income. And right before demanding the cash, Helen had very casually asked how Grandpa Silas's health was holding up these days. The warning shot from my cousin Clara arrived on a rainy Tuesday in early spring, a little over 2 years after my escape.
Clara was the only relative who had ever spoken to me like a human being instead of an appliance. Her text just contained 3 ominous words. "You should see this." Below it was a screenshot from the Sinclair Sam group chat, the exact same chat I was technically still sitting in, but they had quietly booted me from a week prior without a word. They had deliberately spun up a secondary Seraphina-free chat to scheme, and Clara, bless her chaotic heart, had been accidentally added to the new thread.
I collapsed onto a dusty hay bale and read the screenshot twice to ensure my brain was processing the betrayal correctly. Helen had typed, "When Dad passes, the property is worth real money now that someone finally fixed it up. We'll split the acreage 3 ways and sell it all to developers. Seraphina can keep a horse or 2 if she behaves and is reasonable about it." A horse or 2. If I behaved. After 2 solid years of grueling dawn-to-dusk labor that had resurrected 80 rotting acres into a highly profitable enterprise, my own flesh and blood had already chopped up the proceeds in a secret group chat designed specifically to hide the knife. Maya had instantly replied with a sparkling pink heart emoji. My spineless father had chimed in with, "Sounds fair." Sounds fair. I stared at those 2 words until they blurred. I really want to tell you that I threw my phone and screamed in rage. I didn't. I had already spent my entire youth paying out my rage in agonizing installments, and my account was completely empty. What washed over me instead was a strange, hyper-focusing absolute zero, a cold clarity identical to the calm I felt on the day I left. They were never, ever going to change. I already knew that, but now I possessed a much sharper, more dangerous truth. They were already greedily counting the cash built entirely on my broken back, and they were so arrogant about it that they put the conspiracy in writing. I immediately screenshotted Clara's screenshot, backed it up to a cloud drive, and marched out to find my grandfather. I tracked Silas down in the tack room, meticulously oiling a heavy leather bridle. I shoved the phone screen right in his face because I'd stopped keeping secrets from this man a long time ago. He read the messages painfully slowly. I watched a muscle feather in his jaw. Then he gently set the oiled leather down and looked at me with an expression I had never witnessed before. It was a haunting mix of profound grief and dark, grim humor. "Well," he rasped, his voice thick like gravel, "that is my daughter, all right." He didn't offer a single excuse for her. That is a quiet mercy I will be grateful for until the day I die. He just absorbed the full, disgusting weight of it and allowed it to be the ugly truth. Then he said something so softly that it almost didn't register over the rain on the tin roof. "They're busy planning to sell off what they mistakenly believe is mine." I stared at him. "Let them plan, Seraphina." I asked him what the hell that meant. He just reached out, squeezed my shoulder with a calloused hand, and said, "One day this entire operation should be yours. You are the only person who ever bled into this dirt." I brushed the comment off. People say dramatic, sentimental things under the warm glow of barn lights, things that rarely survive the harsh reality of daybreak. I had learned the hard way never to bank my survival on empty promises from anyone sharing the Sinclair bloodline, and Silas, despite his overwhelming goodness, was still technically a Sinclair. So I mentally filed his words under kindness and went straight back to mucking stalls. But I did make a concrete decision for myself that night. I was officially done waiting around to be chosen, and I was entirely done bracing for the impact of being discarded. If the deed to the land eventually came to me, great. If it didn't, I would still survive. Either way, I was going to build this business so massive, so legally bulletproof, and so undeniably successful that no pathetic 3-way inheritance split could erase erase the empire I forged. I sat at his cramped kitchen table at 2 a.m. and drafted a ruthless business plan. My first real one. Boarding, high-level training, a funded rescue R, clinics. I aggressively gave myself 5 years to hit the numbers. I shattered them in 3.
Those next 3 years are the gritty reality nobody ever posts on social media, because agonizing debt and sleep deprivation don't make for aesthetic photos. I marched into the local bank and took out a high-risk operating loan entirely in my own name. It was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. I poured every single cent of it into a massive new barn roof and a state-of-the-art covered riding arena. I chased down elite equestrian certifications, spending my only weekends off sitting in sterile classrooms until the office wall above my desk had more professional acronyms after my name than Helen ever believed my brain could handle. The premium boarding stalls filled up instantly. The wait list swelled. I hired a part-time stable hand and then a full-time property manager. And Bramble, my hopeless throwaway rescue mare, the walking skeleton nobody wanted to pay to save, turned out to carry racing bloodlines worth triple the value of the truck I hauled her in with. Her first healthy foal sold for $12,000 to a high-end show barn 2 states away. I kept her second foal for myself. I took the official bill of sale, framed it in heavy oak, and bolted it to the wall right next to my diplomas. Not to brag about the money, I needed the daily visual proof.
The discarded, unwanted thing had officially become the financial cornerstone of the entire empire. I knew exactly how that felt. Sometime around year 5 of my exile, I completely stopped checking my emotional pulse to see if I was actually happy. I just suddenly noticed on an ordinary Tuesday evening, leaning against the arena fencing with a mug of black coffee, that I already was. I had constructed a life so densely packed with genuine loyalty that there wasn't a single empty chair left for a toxic relative to refuse to fill. I had Lily, who showed up at my gates at 17 with a garbage bag of clothes and nowhere else to turn, and she stayed. I had Beatrice and a fiercely loyal group of boarders who had morphed into my actual family. I had a brilliant equine vet named Dr. Julian Hayes, who mysteriously started finding extra reasons to stop by the ranch between emergency calls. Julian looked at me like I was something rare and precious, rather than something strictly durable and useful. And I had Grandpa Silas. He was moving much slower now, mostly supervising the chaos from a faded folding chair in the shade. But he was still there every single morning. He still proudly referred to me as the woman who runs the place. I foolishly assumed we had decades left in that golden rhythm. I was completely wrong about the timeline, exactly the way you always are with the fiercely stubborn people you naively assume will outlast the farm itself. The first terrifying warning sign arrived on a freezing morning, midway through my 7th year, when Silas physically couldn't pull himself up from his folding chair. It was his heart. The emergency room doctors used very careful, cushioned medical terminology, but the grim reality was completely obvious. He had suffered a quiet event, the terrifying kind of mild heart attack that acts as a stern warning the first time around and a definitive death sentence the second time it hits. They discharged him from the sterile hospital ward on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. He looked so much smaller, so violently fragile sitting in his chair than he had just 3 days prior. I immediately suspended all my advanced training clinics, delegated the heavy machinery work to Lily, and completely rearranged my daily operation to stay within shouting distance of the main house at all times. I thought we had time to adapt to this new, quiet reality. But the absolute last thing I ever expected was exactly how fast the scent of blood would travel down the highway. Exactly 3 days after Silas was discharged from the hospital, my mother finally called. She didn't call me, of course. First, she called the hospital desk. Then she tracked down the neighboring farms, and then she finally dialed my number, desperately fishing for medical details hidden under a paper-thin coat of daughterly concern. "We just want to be there for Dad," she cooed into the phone. "We.
The exact same we that hadn't bothered to drive 3 hours up the highway in 7 long years. Suddenly, the very family that had coldly typed "sounds fair" about liquidating his life's work couldn't wait to rush to his bedside. I am not naive. I knew exactly what this sudden, panicked visit was actually about, and it had absolutely nothing to do with Silas's failing heart. It was about Silas's estate. A dying old man sitting on highly valuable, profitable land is a very different proposition than a stubborn, old failure bleeding money. And Helen had always been brutally aware of the exact price of everything. I told her she could come. I need you to understand my reasoning here. It wasn't weakness or a sudden desire for reconciliation. It was because Silas, propped up weakly in his folding chair, had overheard my end of the phone call and said one very quiet thing. Let them come, Seraphina. Let them show their whole hand. It is always easier to deal with people once you've seen all their cards. So I set a date. I prepared the guest rooms, and I stood at the kitchen window the morning they were scheduled to arrive, wearing my grandfather's leather gloves, watching the long gravel driveway.
I felt the old, suffocating childhood reflex to brace for impact creeping back into my shoulders. But then I forced myself to stop and breathe. This was not their house anymore. This was my territory, and I was hosting them on my terms. I had finally learned the difference. They pulled up in Helen's spotless, least luxury sedan, the three of them, and the absolute first thing Helen did when her expensive heels hit the gravel was scan the property instead of looking toward the house where her father lay sick. I watched her calculate the math in real time. She took in the massive new covered arena, the fully booked boarding barn, and the heady-duty trucks and horse trailers stamped with the ranch's logo on the doors. I watched her cold eyes sweep across 200 acres of prime, restored value, and I physically saw her recalculate the three-way inheritance split in her head. Maya slid out of the backseat next. She was 32 now, but she still moved like the entire world owed her a soft landing. She swept toward me with dramatically open arms. "Seraphina, look at you, all rugged," she giggled, pulling me into a performative hug. I stood perfectly still and let her. My father shuffled out last, hanging back by the bumper. He gave me a weak nod that desperately tried to be an apology, but he completely lacked the spine to back it up. They paraded into the house to see Silas, and they performed their deep concern beautifully for about 20 minutes. Then the real questions started, as gentle and precise as someone picking a lock.
How much total acreage is it exactly? Is the business actually turning a profit yet? Had Dad updated any of his legal paperwork lately? What with his situation? Helen asked it all using that hushed, reverent voice people reserve for the dying, and Silas, propped up on his pillows looking fragile, answered every single probing question with the exact same 2 words: "Ask Seraphina." It drove Helen quietly, visibly insane. She had driven 3 hours to assess a massive inheritance, and she kept being abruptly redirected to the scapegoat daughter she had gleefully discarded. At dinner that night, she tried a different angle. "We've all been so terribly worried about you out here, all alone, sweetheart," she sighed, slicing her steak. Alone, as if I hadn't built a massive, thriving community she could literally see through the dining room window. I just offered a polite smile, passed the mashed potatoes, and replied, "I've honestly never felt less alone." Under the table, with my hands resting in my lap, I noticed how perfectly steady they were. No shaking, no bracing for a blow. For the very first time in my entire life, sitting at a table with my blood relatives, I wasn't waiting for the floor to drop out under me. They left after 2 days, having learned absolutely nothing concrete, but arrogantly assuming everything. Here is exactly what they assumed: that the deed to the land was still in Silas's name, that when he finally passed, the property would go through probate and be divided by his will. 3 ways. exactly the way Helen had already chopped it up in her secret group chat. They assumed I was just a glorified tenant with calluses, a naive caretaker who had done them all a massive financial favor by single-handedly raising the property value right before they swooped in for the sale. What they didn't bother to learn, because they had never once believed I was worth learning about, is what Silas told me the night after their sedan pulled out of the driveway. He called me into the kitchen, had me sit at the table, and slid a heavy manila folder across the worn wood. Inside was a property deed, the land, all the outbuildings, the precious water rights, the business licenses, all of it legally transferred directly into my name, permanently recorded at the county courthouse, and dated 3 years earlier. "I did it the year after you showed me that screenshot," he rasped, tapping the paper. "Walked into the county clerk's office myself, signed it all over, and paid the transfer fee. It's done. It's been done. You don't owe a sale or a split to anybody." I stared blankly at the official county stamp and felt the foundation of my entire life shift, not because of the massive financial windfall. It was because somebody had finally chosen me on permanent legal paper, where it couldn't be instantly taken back just because Maya had a fresher crisis or Helen used a softer voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my throat tight. He almost smiled. "Because you needed to build it like it was already yours, and you needed to earn it like it wasn't. Look at what you built, Seraphina." Then his face grew deadly serious. "Do not tell Helen. Let her keep aggressively planning her little split. The day she finally figures out it was never hers to steal, she will show you exactly who she is, and you will be standing on completely solid ground when she does." I silently put the manila folder into the heavy floor safe. I didn't breathe a word about it to anyone, and I went right back to mucking stalls on land that, it turned out, had belonged to me the entire time. Quick pause before we get to the brutal part. Notice that I never raised my voice or threw a tantrum through any of this. That is not weakness. That is the quiet power of a woman who finally stopped auditioning for love she was never going to get. If that specific idea resonates with you, leave a comment with one boundary you wish you had established sooner. I read every single one. Now, the brutal part. As Silas's health rapidly deteriorated that spring, Maya made her final move, and it was ripped straight out of Helen's old playbook. She started calling Silas directly, sounding incredibly sweet and tearful, armed with a brand new catastrophic crisis. She was supposedly being evicted from her apartment. She claimed she had absolutely nowhere to go. Couldn't her dear, loving grandfather help her out? Maybe with a little cash right now, or maybe with a specific guaranteed mention in his will, just so she'd know she was truly loved before he passed. I only found out about this manipulation because Silas told me himself, shaking his head slowly over his morning coffee. "Your sister apparently thinks I'm dying stupid," he muttered. He had told her no, a flat, unequivocal no. The exact same word that had never been permitted for me as a child was, it turned out, perfectly available when an old man simply decided to wield it. Maya immediately escalated. The frantic phone calls came daily. Then Helen joined the assault, framing the demand as family unity, aggressively suggesting Silas do right by all his grandchildren while he still had the cognitive ability to do so. They had absolutely no idea the deed was already recorded at the courthouse. They were desperately lobbying for a deciding vote in an election that had been over for 3 years. Silas let them keep at it, exactly the way he had instructed me to, gathering their whole hand. But the constant harassment cost him dearly. I would watch him hang up the phone looking gray and utterly exhausted, and I would want to drive into town and tear into them. But he would just pat my hand gently and say, "Soon, Seraphina. Let them write it all down." They were writing it all down, in texts, in demanding voicemails, in a massive, undeniable paper trail of pure greed. They were far too arrogant and sure of themselves to hide their motives. They genuinely thought they were closing in for the kill. They were only building my legal case for me. Silas went downhill rapidly over 6 weeks, the way strong men do, all at once, after a long, stubborn plateau. I moved a hospital bed into the front room so he could watch the horses grazing through the big bay window. I ruthlessly cut my client load in half, refunded the deposits, and learned how to do the quiet, intimate things you learn to do for someone you love who is preparing to leave. I am not going to dress this part up or romanticize it. It was brutal, it was holy, and it was mostly silent. Dr. Hayes came by almost every single evening, completely off the clock, and just sat with us, never once making the heavy silence about himself. Lily seamlessly took over the grueling morning chores without ever being asked. The life I had painstakingly built, the exact life my family claimed made me selfish for abandoning them, turned out to be the exact safety net that held all of us up when it actually mattered. Silas mostly slept through those final weeks, but he had good, lucid hours. During one of them, he quietly asked me to help him walk out to the main fence line one last time. I walked him incredibly slowly, his arm feeling dangerously thin through his heavy flannel shirt, out to the wooden rail where the work gloves hung on a rusty nail. He reached up with a shaking hand and took them down. The cracked brown leather, his father's gloves, the ones he had tossed to me on my first day, promising they would fit when I had finally earned them. He pressed the heavy leather firmly into my bare hands. "They fit now," he whispered, and they did. Somewhere in those 7 years of back-breaking work, my hand had physically grown into them, and I had never even noticed the day it happened. We stood quietly at the rail and watched Bramble graze in the low golden evening light. The useless, throwaway mare. She was sleek, sound, and standing exactly where she belonged. Silas didn't offer any grand, profound speeches. He just squeezed my shoulder once, firmly, and said, "Good work, kid." 3 simple words, the absolute richest inheritance I have ever been handed. He passed away in his sleep exactly 9 days later, with the bedroom window cracked open and the horses calling to each other at dawn. I buried my grandfather on a crisp, clear Saturday in the small cemetery behind the rural country church he had attended for 60 solid years, and half the damn county showed up. Boarders, neighboring farmers, the vet clinic staff, the feed store owner, and dozens of local ranchers he had quietly helped out over the decades and never once mentioned to me. The stubborn man my mother had written off as an embarrassing failure had a line of mud-splattered pickup trucks parked a quarter-mile down the highway. My family came too, obviously. They wore immaculate, expensive black clothes, dabbed their dry eyes with tissues, and gracefully accepted heartfelt condolences they had absolutely not earned. I stood back and watched my mother flawlessly work the crowd at her own father's funeral like it was a corporate networking event. Maya cried prettily and loudly, the exact way she did everything, and naive people who didn't know any better rushed to comfort her. I stood rigidly at the graveside wearing my grandfather's scuffed leather gloves, completely dry-eyed, because I had already done my agonizing grieving in the front room over 6 honest weeks. I had absolutely nothing performative left to give an audience. After the burial, during the stale reception in the cramped church hall, Helen finally cornered me by the coffee urn. She squeezed my arm tightly, dropping her voice into the sharp, clipped register she only ever used for serious business transactions.
"We should probably all sit down soon, sweetheart, to discuss Dad's affairs. The land, the house. We need to settle everything fairly, as a family." There it was. My grandfather wasn't even cold in the dirt, and she was already wielding the word family, a phrase that in her mouth only ever meant her personal agenda, executed strictly on her preferred schedule. I stared out the kitchen window. listening to the breathing of this woman who had deliberately conditioned me to be invincible so she would never, ever have to be soft with me. And in that exact second, I felt the very last emotional hook slip completely out of my jaw. "You're absolutely right," I replied, my voice completely dead level. "Let's settle it. Come out to the ranch this Saturday. Bring whoever you think you need to bring." I could practically hear her smiling through the receiver, making the fatal mistake of confusing my cold calm for total compliance, exactly the way she always had since I was a child. "Wonderful. I'll bring the estate realtor," she chirped. Of course she would. I just nodded to the empty kitchen, took a slow sip of my black coffee, and hung up the phone. Saturday it was. She called me twice more that week to aggressively coordinate the logistics, and every single conversation revealed more of the ruthless strategy she firmly believed was hers to execute. She had already met with a local broker, a brisk, predatory woman named Paula who specialized in liquidating agricultural acreage. Helen had already secured a rough financial valuation, completely sight unseen, based entirely on whatever arrogant guesses she had made from the driveway. $2 million, give or take, for the raw acreage and the boarding operation as a going concern. She had even decided on the exact inheritance split, a third for her, a third for Maya, and a third for my father, which was realistically just a second third sliding directly into Helen's bank account. And for me, the discarded daughter who had literally bled into the dirt to build every single dollar of that $2 million valuation, she had prepared an offer she genuinely thought was magnanimous. "You can keep your personal riding horses, obviously," she told me on Thursday, "and we'll make absolutely sure you get the first option to rent the property back from the new corporate owners. Family helps family, Seraphina." I literally had to set the phone down on the counter and remember how to breathe, not out of blinding anger, but out of sheer overwhelming awe at the architectural beauty of her delusion. She had intentionally canceled my 25th birthday because I was the strong one who supposedly didn't require basic human consideration. Now she was meticulously preparing to evict me from the massive empire I had built with my own ruined hands, and she was aggressively framing it as a generous favor. She literally could not conceive of a reality where this land wasn't already hers to chop up and sell. "We can only show up for one of you at a time," she had told me 9 years ago. At 34, she was about to forcefully learn the compound interest of a lifetime of that exact arithmetic. I picked the phone back up and simply said, "See you Saturday, Helen." I didn't warn her, I didn't gloat or tip my hand. Silas had taught me much better than that. You never announce the grand reveal. You let arrogant people build the gallows themselves, right in front of an audience, and then you simply hand them the heavy rope they brought with them. On Saturday, my mother was bringing a corporate realtor to sell my own deeded property back to me. I let her. I spent the remainder of that week precisely orchestrating exactly how I wanted Saturday afternoon to unfold. For the very first time in my existence, I held every single winning card in the deck. I desperately wanted to play this hand with absolute grace, not petty malice. I could have easily ambushed her at the front iron gates with the recorded deed and a smug smirk. I didn't want that cheap satisfaction. I wanted the brutal truth to land in broad daylight directly in front of the exact people whose social opinions she actually cared about, leaving zero room for her to conveniently revise the narrative later into a tragic story where she was the victim. So I turned it into a formal gathering. I called Silas's estate attorney, a soft-spoken, razor-sharp man named Harrison Pratt, who had personally helped record my deed 3 years prior. I asked him to attend on Saturday and to bring a legally certified copy of the paperwork. I formally invited several of the long-term boarders and neighboring farmers who had attended the funeral, framing the afternoon as a small, intimate memorial lunch for Silas, out at the property he loved so much, which, honestly, it genuinely was. Julian would be there, Lily would be there, Bramble would be grazing in the near pasture, fully visible from the wraparound porch, serving as the living, breathing proof of exactly what this ranch had become. I wasn't building a vicious trap. I was meticulously building a room where the truth physically couldn't be twisted, simply because too many honest, credible people would be standing in it. My weapon of choice was never going to be screaming volume or cheap cruelty. Helen had spent 34 years effortlessly wielding emotional manipulation, calculated lies, and the soft, twisting knife of who needs us more. I absolutely refused to fight her with her own rusty blade. I was going to fight her with a county clerk's red ink stamp and a front lawn full of unimpeachable witnesses. And I was going to dismantle her reality without raising my voice a single time. That was the entire core of the revenge, not to inflict pain, to simply, finally stand on solid ground she couldn't steal and watch her break her own teeth against the absolute fact of it. Saturday arrived perfectly clear and brutally bright. Out of pure ingrained habit, I pulled on Silas's heavy leather work gloves, then took them right back off and laid them deliberately on the porch post where he would want them resting for this exact moment. They arrived promptly at 11 in the morning, and Helen had dressed impeccably for a high-end real estate closing. She marched up the driveway in sharp designer heels that immediately sank into the gravel.
Paula, the aggressive realtor, was right in tow, clutching a thick leather folio. Maya and my father trailed uselessly behind them. The memorial lunch was already in full swing on the wide wooden porch and the manicured front lawn. Beatrice was there, along with 3 other premium boarders, 2 local farmers who had known Silas for 40 years, and Harrison, the attorney, wearing a quiet gray suit that nobody had clocked as anything other than standard morning attire. Julian stood casually by the bottom steps. Lily leaned heavily against the wooden rail. Bramble grazed 40 feet away in the near pasture, sleek, dark, and utterly impossible to miss. Helen surveyed the entire scene with the deep, greedy satisfaction of a woman touring a luxury property she is about to happily liquidate. She didn't come to grieve her father, she came to take inventory of his assets. After a respectable 10 minutes of graciously accepting condolences from my friends, she actually clinked a silver fork against a crystal water glass at my porch at my grandfather's memorial, demanding everyone's attention like a practiced society hostess. "I just want to thank you all so much for loving my father," she began, her voice dripping with warm, rehearsed sincerity. This beautiful land meant absolutely everything to him, and I know in my heart he would want it cared for properly now that he's gone. She let that heavy, emotional sentiment settle over the quiet crowd. Then she delivered the exact line she had driven 3 hours up the highway to say. "So, our family has made the difficult decision to sell the ranch to good, capable people who will truly honor his legacy. Paula here will be handling the transition." She actually reached out and placed a manicured hand on the realtor's shoulder, presenting the woman to the crowd like a generous gift. "And please don't worry about Seraphina. She will be very well taken care of." A low, highly confused murmur rippled through the people on the porch. Every single person standing on that wood knew exactly whose ranch this was, even if Helen was completely delusional. I saw Beatrice's eyebrows shoot up to her hairline. I saw a neighboring farmer shoot me a deeply bewildered look. Helen completely mistook the stunned silence for respectful awe and confidently pressed on, openly detailing the $2 million valuation, the aggressive sales timeline, and the supposedly fair 3-way family split. I just let her talk. I let her dig the hole all the way to the bottom. I let her get every single arrogant word out in broad daylight, in front of every single witness. Then, when she finally turned her body toward me, flashing a sickeningly benevolent smile, and asked, "Isn't that right, sweetheart?"
I slowly set my ceramic coffee mug down on the railing and took one step forward. "Actually, Helen," I replied, and my voice came out so incredibly level and clear that it carried much farther than I expected across the dead quiet lawn. "The ranch isn't yours to sell." She let out a high, tight, social laugh meant to instantly pacify the crowd. "Honey, please, this really isn't the time or place. We will handle the legal paperwork privately." "We can actually handle it right now," I said, calmly, not breaking eye contact. "Harrison," the quiet man in the gray suit stepped forward, and I watched my mother's flawless face fully register that the silent mourner she had completely ignored was now opening a leather folio of his own. "I am Harrison Pratt," he announced clearly. "I was Silas's personal estate attorney for over 20 years. He opened the dark folder and held up a single heavy sheet of paper with a bright red county seal stamped firmly at the bottom.
This is a legally certified copy of the recorded deed for this exact property, Harrison stated. Silas transferred full, unencumbered ownership of the land, the structures, and all attached water and mineral rights directly to Seraphina Sterling. He paused, letting the heavy words hang in the humid air. 3 years ago. It has been hers, free and clear, since then. There is absolutely nothing in this estate for you to sell. There was nothing to split. The suffocating silence that followed had an actual physical texture to it. Paula, the aggressive corporate realtor, very slowly and deliberately snapped her leather folio shut. My father's mouth fell open and clicked shut again like a landed fish. And Helen's face did something I had never, ever seen it do in 34 years. It completely cracked. The pristine, practiced performance fell off her skin all at once, and underneath it was something raw, ugly, and for just a fraction of a second, genuinely terrified. "That is legally impossible," she spat, her voice trembling. "He was deeply confused. He was gravely ill. You manipulated a dying old man out of his assets." "He officially recorded it 3 years ago," Harrison corrected her mildly, adjusting his glasses. "He drove down to the county clerk's office himself." "He was significantly sharper than most men half his age," Harrison finished. I looked directly at my mother, and I honestly did not feel the fiery, vindictive triumph I had spent years bracing for. I felt something much quieter and infinitely sadder. I physically felt the entire rotten architecture of my childhood finally collapse in public, in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, exactly the way I had orchestrated. And there was absolutely no joy in the wreckage, only a clean, sterile, and intensely final closing of a door. Down in the near pasture, Bramble briefly lifted her heavy head at the sudden rise in human voices, then casually went right back to tearing up grass, completely unbothered. The throwaway mare standing securely on her entirely unsellable land. I let the brutal truth sit heavily in the air for a moment longer. Then I finally looked at my mother and said the one thing I had waited 9 grueling years to say. I said it incredibly softly, because the softest words always leave the deepest bruises. "You always told me you could only show up for one of us at a time. Grandpa showed up for me on permanent legal paper. Try and cancel that." That is the exact moment they completely came apart. All 3 of them shattered, exactly the way Silas had predicted they would the second they realized the rigged casino was permanently closed. Helen went first, and she went incredibly loud. "After absolutely everything I sacrificed for you?" she shrieked on my front porch, screaming in front of 40 years' worth of my grandfather's most loyal friends. "I raised you, I housed you, and this is exactly how you repay your own flesh and blood? By maliciously stealing your vulnerable sister's inheritance?
She was physically vibrating with rage, her manicured finger jabbing the air, her voice climbing into a shrill, hysterical register these local farmers had never once heard from the always polished Helen. I just stood there with my hands in my pockets. I didn't raise my voice a single decibel to match hers. I had finally learned the ultimate truth. The calmest person in a room full of screaming is the only one the audience actually believes. Maya went next, hitting her theatrical cue perfectly, instantly switching from fake grief to a brand new medical crisis in under a single breath. "I can't believe this is happening," she wailed dramatically, pressing a trembling hand to her chest and dropping to her knees on the wooden porch boards. "I feel so faint. I think I'm having a heart attack. Somebody help me." And for the very first time in my entire existence, absolutely nobody moved toward her. Not one single person on that porch took a step. The boarders just looked away, deeply embarrassed by the pathetic performance. The old, reliable reflex, the exact same manufactured panic that had successfully canceled my entire childhood, suddenly found itself playing to a completely empty room. And my father, my quiet, spineless father, who had desperately kept the peace by willingly sacrificing me at every single turn, did the saddest thing of all. He took one hesitant step toward me, pulling slightly away from his wife. His eyes were actually wet, and he whispered, "I really should have come to that birthday dinner, Seraphina." For one fraction of a second, the ice around my heart actually shifted. But then he nervously glanced back over his shoulder at Helen's furious face, and I watched the tiny bit of spine completely drain out of him, exactly the way it always had. He tucked his head down and stepped right back to her side. Near, sympathetic, entirely unchanged. He had been given 34 years and a funeral to finally choose me, and even now, knowing the absolute truth, he chose his abuser in the space of a single backward glance. That pathetic retreat told me vastly more than any recorded deed ever could. Helen kept aggressively screaming about hiring trial lawyers, contesting the estate, and suing for undue influence. Harrison, entirely unbothered by the noise, simply adjusted his tie and told her she was more than welcome to waste her money trying. But the recording was legally airtight and the witnesses were far too numerous. And I just stood firmly in the center of the chaos, the strong one, finally getting the privilege of being strong entirely on my own terms. And I felt absolutely nothing I needed to act on. I just waited patiently for them to completely run out of noise. When the hysterical shouting finally guttered out, because screaming always dies when absolutely nobody feeds it the attention it craves, I spoke one last time. I kept my voice low, and the entire porch went dead still to catch the words. "I am not going to fight you in a courtroom, Helen," I stated flatly. "You would lose horribly, and it would cost you money you clearly don't have. So here is exactly what is going to happen right now. You are going to get in your leased car, you are going to drive back the 3 hours you just came, and you are never going to call this ranch again." Helen opened her mouth to snap back. I didn't let her. For 34 years, I had let her speak first, not today. "You constantly told me I was the strong one, solely so you would never, ever have to actually give me anything," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air. "You canceled my birthday to cater to a tantrum. You literally built a secret group chat just to keep me out of my own family. You drove out here today to casually sell the only home that ever actually wanted me. And you had the nerve to call it doing me a favor?" I looked hard at the three of them, then at the humiliated realtor, and finally at the loyal friends who had genuinely loved my grandfather. "You taught me a long time ago that family is simply whoever actually shows up," I told them. "None of you ever did. So I built my own." Then I raised my hand and gestured, as calm as anything in the world, toward the long stretch of the gravel driveway. "The gates are this way." And I walked them to it myself. I escorted them the entire length of the drive, past the massive new riding arena, past the fully booked boarding stalls, and right past the throwaway mare nobody had wanted. My heavy work boots fell steady and sure on ground that was entirely mine. I didn't slam a single door. I didn't scream or hurl insults. I simply didn't need to. I just pulled the heavy iron gate open, stood quietly beside the hinges, and waited. They left the exact way bitter people leave when they've catastrophically lost but lack the grace to admit it. The sedan's engine revved far too loud, the tires kicked up a spray of sharp gravel, and not one of them dared to look back in the rearview mirror. Paula, the realtor, had actually pulled out first. She looked deeply embarrassed and gave me a small, intensely apologetic nod through her window that I appreciated vastly more than she will ever know. Then came Helen's spotless sedan. Maya was already aggressively tapping on her phone in the back seat, desperately hunting the internet for her next available source of cheap sympathy. My father sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at a fading highway that led directly back to the exact same small house and the exact same suffocatingly small life I had finally escaped. I stood alone at the open gate and watched the luxury car shrink down the long drive, turn sharply onto the county road, and completely disappear into the afternoon heat shimmer. I didn't feel the urge to break down crying. I didn't feel the urge to throw my hands up and cheer. I just felt the heavy, peaceful quiet completely flood back into the property. The good kind of quiet. The rare kind I had driven 3 hours in the dark and bled for 9 grueling years to finally earn. Behind me, in the near pasture, Bramble lifted her dark head and nickered low in her throat, the exact way she always did when she wanted me to come back to the fence rail and scratch her neck. So I pushed the heavy iron gate shut, slid the thick metal bolt firmly home, and turned around to walk straight back toward my actual life. There was a memorial luncheon to finish with my friends. There were 40 horses waiting to be fed. There was an entire afternoon of simply being free stretching out in front of me. That was a little over a year ago. Helen eventually had a cheap lawyer send exactly one aggressive letter threatening to officially contest the recorded deed. Harrison Pratt mailed a single legal response back, and we quite literally never heard from that law firm again. Maya actually had the nerve to call me once, about 6 months later.
She didn't call to apologize, of course. She called to beg for money. The exact same way water always finds the exact same crack in the foundation, every single time. I told her no, very kindly, and I hung up the phone. And I felt absolutely nothing afterward, except the mild, beautiful surprise of realizing just how incredibly light a clean, unapologetic no can actually be. I haven't spoken a single word to my parents since I bolted that gate shut. I honestly don't expect to ever again. Some doors you have to permanently close, just so the rest of your house can finally get warm. The ranch is absolutely thriving. The waitlist for a stall is up to 14 names now. Lily just turned 20, and she is already successfully running her own roster of private training clients. Last month, I handed her a brand new pair of thick leather work gloves, stiff, pale, and unbroken. I told her they would fit her perfectly when she had finally earned them. I watched her frown, not entirely understanding what I meant yet, but she will. Julian and I got married this past spring, right out by the covered arena, with the boarders, the neighbors, and the horses watching us over the wooden rail. It was small, it was fiercely honest, and absolutely nobody fainted in the parking lot.
Bramble dropped her 3rd healthy foal in April. A gorgeous, leggy filly that I am permanently keeping for myself, because there are some bloodlines you ruthlessly protect once you finally understand their true worth. And Silas's old gloves still hang on that rusty nail by the tackroom door. I pull them on every single morning before the sun comes up. The cracked brown leather is incredibly soft at the knuckles now. His father's gloves before him. Mine now. And they fit my hands absolutely perfectly. The truth is, they have fit me for years. I just didn't notice the exact day it happened.
The exact same way I didn't notice the specific Tuesday I completely stopped waiting for a phone call from people who were never, ever going to make the drive. Here is the only absolute truth I know for sure anymore. Blood is what made us genetic relatives, but it never once made us a family. And the day I finally stopped begging the first to act like the second was the very day I suddenly had enough room in my life for the people who simply showed up. That is my story. 1 canceled birthday dinner, 9 years of back-breaking dirt, and an iron gate I finally got to slam shut on my own terms. If there is someone in your life who keeps casually labeling you the strong one, purely as a convenient excuse to leave you out in the cold, let tonight be the brutal nudge you have been desperately waiting for. You are entirely allowed to pack your bags and go build a table of your own. Share this story with whoever desperately needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment below about the boundary you are finally setting, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I will see you then.